Welcome to Quickfire Questions with Fairfax and Favour, where we will be putting some quickfire questions, as the name might suggest, to some of the best riders in the business. And today's guest is the 2020 USEA Leading Rider of the Year. It is Liz Halliday-Sharp. Liz, are you ready?
I'm ready.
What is your favourite meal?
I think it would have to be a really nice steak dinner.
What Fairfax and Favour item is your go-to when you go out for dinner?
I really love the Kensington. It's such a gorgeous short boot, and you can wear it with, jeans or nice trousers or even a dress. So I'd say that's my main go-to.
What is your secret weapon?
Coffee.
What bee is your favourite? Bags, boots or belts?
Am I allowed to say all three? If it's from Fairfax and
Absolutely.
Favour, I actually do love all three.
There we go. Liz Halliday-Sharp, thank you very much for going under our quickfire questions with Fairfax and Favour.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Oh God, it's so exciting. Happy Hail Bob Day.
It is a happy Hail Bob Day.
That was our elo coming in for competition.
Eventing Manager is back.
Best show that we have, Alphabetti Spaghetti.
Looking forward to seeing quality horses.
I mean, you're a bit of an eventing geek just like us.
Welcome to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast, and listeners, we are back with the Hall of Fame series and another episode for you. And my goodness, you are not going to want to miss this one. It has been a little while since we have done a Hall of Fame episode. I have missed it, and I know another lady who is very much looking forward to this show is Catherine Austin. Catherine, it is good to be back, and I feel like we are in for a real treat.
Aren't we? This is so interesting. I think the word legend is very overused, particularly in sport. But the person that we are about to speak to really is a legend. And I mean, not just in terms of her achievements, but almost her mythical status. This is someone whose eventing career was relatively brief, but who sort of still remains above everybody else because of one set of extraordinary achievements. And I'm really looking forward to meeting her, as it were.
We cannot wait, listeners, to give you an insight into, as Catherine has said, an extraordinary career, albeit a fairly short eventing career that then went into a much longer show jumping career that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail as well. It is none other than the first ever Burghley winner. She's won badminton too, amongst many other achievements. We'll come on to plenty of them in the show. Anneli Drummond-Hay, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm very honoured to have such a big build-up.
No pressure now. No, it's going to be fine. We're looking forward to finding out a little bit more about your career, because there have been so many incredible achievements. But first of all, let's go back to where it started. Where did your love of horses come from? And were they something that you always wanted to pursue?
No, I wouldn't say at all. I was brought up in a funny time of the world. I was born just before the war, the Second War, obviously. Everything fell by the wayside. You just had to fight for your country. And I mean, obviously I wasn't, because I was too young. But so my education was just not attended to. And my mother was doing sort of war duties and things like that. My father was fighting the war. And we had ponies. My mother used to have a polo club before the war. So there were always ponies there. And I just buried myself with these ponies. And I didn't have kids my own age to play with. And not going to school, of course, didn't help. So I couldn't read or write until I was 10. Which, I mean, nowadays is absolutely dreadful, because children can do it when they're 3 or 4 now. So I was totally illiterate. And then my mother got a governess, and there was a few other kids that she dragged in round about where we lived. And I did lessons for about 2 hours a day and then went back to the ponies. The ponies were my number one interest. And of course that graduated to being a horse. So I think that's probably how it all started. And I was obviously quite good at riding at an early age. And you tend to sort of like the things that you're good at rather than doing the things you aren't so good at. And I rode horses and I played the piano. And that was about all I could do.
Anneli, how did eventing first appear in your life?
Well, my older sister, Jane, had ridden at badminton as a complete amateur also, not having done anything except a bit of pony club. And she rode a horse that they'd bought, my mother and her had bought, called Happy Night, and she rode it at badminton. Didn't have to qualify or anything, you just rode. I mean, you entered and you rode, and she came second. That sort of inspired me, really, although I was much too young then, because I was 6-7 years younger than her. But that sort of inspired me to try and emulate her. And that was it, I suppose. Because in those days, although we had quite a close involvement with Pat Smythe, her family had stayed with us during the war. I have no idea why, I was too young to know. But after the war, she branched off and with a polo pony that we had and got into the British show jumping team. So that also intrigued me. And that was sort of at the back of my mind. But the eventing was more sort of acceptable because you could do it with an ordinary horse. It didn't have to be that special a jumper. I mean, it couldn't be useless, but it didn't have to be. You could train it to become quite good and obedient.
Obviously, the horse that you will forever be associated with, Merely a Monarch, how old were you when you came across him, and how much eventing and competing had you done beforehand?
Oh, no. I bought him as a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
He was unbroken.
And were you eventing a lot already then?
Yes, I was eventing. I was eventing everything I got, had to event. And some of them were, my photographs from those days, some of them were horrible, but I wouldn't ride them today. But anyway, that was all I had. I suppose I got him about 6 years after I'd been eventing.
Okay.
And he was a naughty boy, unbroken. He bucked me off regularly, but he was terribly talented, but a huge power and a huge character. And a lot of a sort of look at me. When people saw him, they sort of couldn't stop looking at him because he had this wonderful sort of aura about him. And I was just very fortunate that, in fact, I advertised in Horse and Hound that I wanted a young horse. And I got many, many answers, and he was one of them, but he was too young. He was only 2. And 2-year-olds are a bit boring because you can't really do anything with them, even 3-year-olds. But I thought, well, I can have a 3-year-old and I stop fiddling with it. But because he was 2, I sort of decided that he was not going to be, no matter how nice he looked at that age, because it was going to be too long to get him to come to the party. And luckily, they sent me a photograph, and in my normal sort of silly way, I lost the photo. But it was obviously sort of meant to be, because about 6 months later, I found the photo, and on the back, luckily, was the address of where the horse was. And he happened to be right next door to a 3-day event that I was going to go and ride in. And I was on another horse, obviously. And I phoned up the people. I thought this horse looks actually very nice. He's now nearly 3. And phoned up and see if they've still got him. And they did still have him. And that's what happened. When I went to ride it, they had a big 3-day event at a place called Harwood in Yorkshire. So when I went up there, I went to have a look at them. And that was it. The horse is not normal. He was too special.
You made it happen in terms of sort of starting your journey with him. But talk us through the next few years, because he was a 3-year-old then, I think you say, when you bought him. But actually, am I right in saying that when he won Burghley, he was only a 6-year-old in 1961, the first ever Burghley that ran?
Yeah, I didn't intend to ride him. I entered him, but I don't know why I did, but I did. But I was intending to ride another horse, which belonged to somebody else. And things went a bit wrong with the other horse, and I had a bit of a fight with the trainer, and he wanted me to put another bridle on, and I didn't want to ride without the bridle. And anyway, to cut a long story short, he said, I think we better call it a day. And so, having Monarch entered, I thought, well, I think he's done enough to be able to do it. So I took him to Burghley, the first Burghley. Yeah, but he was only 6. He should never have gone, but he did. He was obviously, by this time, I realised he was very special. Everything he went into, he won, whether it was a dressage or jumping. He won umpteen jumping, fox hunter jumping competitions. Not huge, but sort of big enough. People have never stopped trying to buy him every time I went out with him. Said him. He had that look of eagles about him.
And what was that Burghley like for you? Because it was your first 5-star victory. It was the first ever Burghley back in 1961. What was it like? He was a 6-year-old. It feels like you were sort of the underdogs at the competition. How did it play out?
Well, Burghley, as you know, was the first Burghley ever. And Burghley's quite hilly, and there's a lot of sort of steep jumps down the hill and up the hill and whatever, and water and whatever else. And the course builder had over-egged the pudding, and the course was absolutely dreadful. And my heart was in my mouth because I didn't want to hurt this precious horse I had. And that was it. And luckily, I was drawn last to go. And in those days when we had cross-country, we had roads and tracks and steeplechase, and you went quite a long way before you actually did the cross-country proper. And then there was a sort of 10-minute break where you had a drink and cooled down a bit before you went on to the 5 miles of cross-country. And when I got into my special box after doing the roads and tracks and the steeplechase, my informers told me that the course is really playing havoc. Every single horse has fallen down, and there was my precious 6-year-old that I hadn't really intended riding, about to be, I was about to smash him, and my heart was in my mouth. Anyway, I rode very carefully, and he didn't get smashed. And he got and so we went way in the lead because everybody else had falling faults, and we didn't. And that was it. And he won by about 50 marks, I think.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And then over the winter, obviously the next thing to do was badminton. You know, there wouldn't have been anything else, I imagine, on your mind.
I'd ridden at badminton a few times on lesser horses, and I'd been second and third, but I'd never won it. And I really had wanted to win it. And I thought, well, this horse, he's going to win it easily because he didn't have a weak sort of part about him. His dressage was always superb. He nearly always won. His cross-country was just amazing. He never had to really gallop because he was such a good mover. He just had to canter and be the same time as other horses that were galloping. And his show jumping was obviously superb. The way I saw it is that he had badminton in the bag. It sounds very conceited, but I didn't mean it that way.
Just confidence, yeah.
Yeah, and that was him, you know. He was just amazing. And he won the dressage by about 30 marks. And then, of course, coasted around the cross-country, then jumped again around the show jumping. And I can't remember by how much we won, but it was quite a big margin.
And was it much tougher than Burghley, the cross-country?
Different, not as hilly. Burghley is very steep, hills up and down in over ditches. And Burghley also had a dreadful problem, which nobody knew about until we started, was that you had to jump into the lake, and the lake started developing a hole in it. So horse after horse were jumping into the lake and collapsing. Well, luckily, because I was last to go in the cross-country, my informers told me, do not jump the gate in the middle or on the right or whatever it was. You must keep well to the left and you'll avoid the hole. So that's what happened. So luckily, going to the end.
I just wondered, because badminton was so much more established by that stage than Burghley, whether there was any difference in the sort of degree of, you know, difficulty, because we obviously didn't have the star ratings that we do now and this kind of thing. And I wondered whether badminton, despite being the flatter terrain, was a harder test, but I guess not. You know.
No, I don't think it was probably more galloping and more sailing. I mean, I've got a few photos of going around the cross country, and there were big sort of tricanas and things you could gallop down to, but from grass to grass. And the water jump was, you didn't want to jump in it because it was quite deep, but Luckington Lane, they were all sort of technical but fair. I think Burghley was verging on not being fair, but it was still, I mean, it was lovely to win at Burghley. And the main thing was I didn't hurt my horse. But badminton was something I'd never won, and I'd ridden about 3 or 4 times, and I wanted to win it, and he did it easily.
And had you thought going into badminton already about a potential switch to show jumping if you could pull off that victory?
I think you're probably right. And, it's such a long time ago, I can't really remember, but he was so talented. He had actually become an A grade by the time he went to badminton, even though he was he was just 7 then, coming 7. And I think I'd sort of, because he was so precious and so special, I wanted to keep him as long as possible. And eventing horses, generally speaking, are more prone to injury and not lasting so long. And I wanted to keep him as long as possible. And of course, I'd always aspired to trying to be a top show jumper, and I'd never had a horse that was good enough. And he obviously was. I mean, the first year that I started show jumping proper, it was the same year that he won badminton. And I think 2 or 3 months later, we had a big international show at a place called White City, and in the middle of London. And he won the Queen's Cup. He won badminton and then he won the Queen's Cup jumping, and it was just. But I mean, I was terribly ignorant. Where there was 5 strides, I put 4 and nearly put 1 stride in a 2-striding double and things like that. But he was just. I mean, the show jumpers just couldn't believe what they were seeing. He was just not a normal horse.
And how did it progress from there? How did his show jumping career develop?
Well, that way. I'd always secretly wanted to show jump because it was a bit more sort of refined, perhaps, a bit more, and it was probably more challenging to me because I found that it wasn't so easy, especially when the jumps got higher and sort of you were jumping 5 foot and upwards. And having a horse that could do this enabled me to have a proper go at it. And eventing, I found. I mean, it sounds awfully big-headed, but I didn't mean it that way. I found was almost too easy with a horse like Monarch because he was so gifted. He was just head and shoulders above everything else. So show jumping was not so easy. And it had also a bigger challenge in that I could sort of travel the world and hopefully keep him longer,
And you took him all over Europe, didn't you? And did you take him to America as well? I know you had a lot of success over there.
I did. He went, America, mostly Europe and America, I would say, the main places. And, I went to America because I had a bit of a blupse during my show jumping when he started having the odd stop. And I was getting headline news because, the headline would read, Monarch stops again or something like that, which was absolutely devastating for me. And it was found out that there was something wrong with him, and that was why he was putting in the odd stop. Anyway, we fixed the problem, and then I started jumping again, and I got an invitation to go to America, and I thought, well, I'll do that, and then I can get away from all the gossipers and the people sort of had nasty things to say. And so I went to America for 6-7 months and did the winter circuit, and it was amazing. But again, that was quite traumatic because I couldn't actually crack a win. There was 4 big shows: Washington, Harrisburg, Madison Square Garden in New York, and then Toronto. And he hardly ever had a fault. But I was second and second and second. I think I had 17 second prizes. I couldn't crack a win. And it wasn't until I got to Toronto, the very final event was the Grand Prix, and he won it. And I was so traumatized by this. I just burst into tears, and nobody could understand what on earth was the matter. But it was all the build-up of not being able to win.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because we talk about it a lot today in terms of the pressure of social media, and everybody has an opinion on things. But actually, it sounds like it was just like that those years ago, but it was headlines that were coming at you, and the pressure was just as intense, but in a totally different way.
And they were proper sports stars, they got actual newspaper coverage and were really famous, genuinely.
I think you're right. And I'd sort of, although I'd done eventing and I'd sort of been quite successful eventing, it wasn't hitting the headlines like the show jumping was. And the show jumping used to have, they'd have a full page of the results of show jumping in the Daily Express and certainly in the Daily Telegraph and the Times, and even the more sort of other papers. They would do a coverage. So and also the other thing is that they gave during the Horse of the Year show and Royal International, they used to take an hour out every evening and cover it with live television, and that would happen for about 5 or 6 days of the week. So there wasn't other sports for people to watch, so they had to watch either soccer or show jumping. So one became a household name quite easily amongst people who really didn't know anything about horses, but they sort of liked it because it was an easy game to follow.
So interesting, isn't it? We think our world goes forwards, but sometimes it goes backwards, you know.
It really does.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I mean, even in South Africa, when I want to watch a sports channel, there's about 200 to choose from. People aren't forced to look at the sport that we were doing nowadays because you've got so many other sports on. And I think that the show jumping, it forced people to follow it, and you became a household name, not really meaning to, but it just happened that way.
You achieved so very much together, but never quite that Olympic spot. Does that still rankle? I imagine it probably does.
Well, it was a very strange. You see, in those days, you had 3 people in the team for the Olympics, and all 3 scores counted. There wasn't a throwaway score. Actually, I think they've gone back to 3 now.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, sometimes things go full circle, don't they?
But for a few years, they have had 4, and you've got a throwaway score. It relieves the pressure a little bit. When I was sort of involved, there was an awful lot of jealousy and backbiting, and for the other people that were sort of marginally as good. I mean, it was a difficult choice because there was 6 or 8 people that you could choose from. And I mean, the one Olympic year, they put up, I'm trying to think which year it was, they put up so many Olympic trials to make sure that they made the right choice. And obviously the horses that had possibility of going to the Olympics would enter it because the courses were huge and probably bigger than the Olympics. They were massive and terribly demanding and funny distances and whatever. And the Olympic selection of whatever it was, 10, 12 horses, we were told we had to compete in these trials in order to be selected. So I duly did it with Harvey Smith was another one, and I can't remember who it was, but anyway. But we burnt our horses out. And by the time the Olympics came, our horses were lame or they were worn out. And so they ended up, it was the Tokyo Olympics, I think, that's right. They ended up taking a team that hadn't actually done any of these trials, which was idiotic. So all us people that had done the trials, we were kicked out.
You didn't actually make the team. Would it be fair to say that, because one of the influences, I think, in your move from eventing to show jumping was that actually women couldn't compete in the Olympics in eventing in the early 60s. That changed in 1963. But is that something, looking back on, that you're very proud to have been a trailblazer for women in the sport? Obviously, there were the influences of the likes of Pat Smythe and so on, but
no, not particularly. I wasn't very that way inclined. I was doing it because I enjoyed the sport. I wasn't sort of pro the women's side of it, and it didn't make any difference for me.
Looking back at it now, do you think it did make a difference at the time, looking back at it?
No. Maybe, I don't know. Didn't intrigue me that.
Can I ask you about talking about the sort of the different trials for eventing and for the show jumping, sorry. And actually there was a horse called Sporting Ford, I think it was, who was a jumper, went to Windsor, was jumping, and things weren't quite going to plan. So the horse that had never evented before rocked up to win one of the final Olympic eventing selection trials. Tell us about that, because that's just incredible.
You've done a very good reading to know about that. He was a horse that had an amazing ability. He could jump houses. And in fact, I broke the British high jump record, but I don't think it's ever been tabulated because there wasn't an official there to verify it. But it was actually the high jump record for Britain on this horse because he could jump mountains, but he wasn't very careful. When I say he's not very careful, he could just push a pole down in the show jumping and go clear apart from that. And when you're show jumping and you've got a horse that doesn't quite put the effort in, it's terribly irritating when they go and have a pole down, and which they needn't have had. I had sort of been used to Monarch, who always tried to clear the fence, and this horse hadn't always tried. And I rode him at Windsor. There was, well, I think they still have a show at Windsor, don't they? It was a 3-day show in those days, and it was jumping all 3 days. And I rode him the first day, and he had a couple of jumps down. I was really very fed up with him because he needn't have had them. It wasn't because he was in the wrong place or whatever. And I had him entered for a one-day event at a place called Batsford. I don't know why I entered him there, but anyway, it was a selection for 3-day event Olympics. I'd never evented him, and I was so fed up with him on the first day at Windsor that I put him in the box and drove off to Batsford, rode him in the one-day event there. And I really can't remember whether I walked the course the day before or whatever. I must have worn the morning early, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. I was cross with him. So I just galloped him around the cross country, and I thought, well, you know, you pick up your legs or not, as the case may be, it's your problem. And he was fantastic. He jolly well knew that it was solid and couldn't bash it. And we came out and won it quite easily because he was quite good at dressage, and yeah, we won it. And there was all the Olympic contenders competing in it. I don't know. I suppose you didn't have to qualify in those days. I can't remember. Of course, that was the first Olympic trial for the eventers. And then I took him back to Windsor that night and jumped him in the championship at Windsor. And he just got beaten. Changed horse. Much more careful.
Were you ever tempted after that? Did you miss eventing? Did you think not at all?
No, because I found it wasn't as pure. Show jumping is more pure, and yeah, look, I mean, I loved the eventing, and I did it for, I don't know, 9-10 years. But you sort of could do it with any horse within reason. But when you've got a special horse like Monarch, it was taking a bit of a chance to hurt him.
And the end of Monarch's career was sort of the big change in your life, wasn't it? Because you moved to South Africa, and was it about 1971, and his show jumping career finished about then. And I think he had a happy hunting retirement, didn't he? And
I think you're right. Marilyn worked for me for quite a few years, and she absolutely adored Monarch. And he was starting to get not very. He wasn't unsound, but he was getting a bit sore. We used to, in those days, jump our horses on butazolidine. Everybody did, and then it became illegal, so I couldn't use that. And he started sort of getting a bit sore and ouchy, so I decided to call it a day with him. And then I met my ex-husband, Errol, and unfortunately I decided to get married to him, but anyway, that's another story. It lasted for a few years, but it was really tough. But coming to South Africa, I obviously didn't want to bring Monarch here because he was already, I think he was about 16 or 17. So he was obviously sort of not to be competed on anymore. Anyway, he'd done big shows and he wasn't going to come and compete in South Africa. And so that was it. And so she took him and hunted him and looked after him for about 8 or 10 years. And he had a happy sort of end to his life.
And you moved to South Africa and obviously continued your show jumping career, but it must have been incredibly different. What was the show jumping scene like? How did you make a career work there?
You know, when you fall in love with somebody, you get a bit stupid. And I met Errol when I was competing out here as a visitor. And he was very much a ladies' man and very persuasive. And I didn't realise that he'd sort of done the same to lots of other ladies. And anyway, I was swept off my feet and decided that probably I think I was about 33 then. I was probably time to hang my boots up and come and settle down with the man who I thought was going to be the love of my life. Anyway, so it meant leaving show jumping and settling into a new country. So I decided to do it. And I haven't really got regrets. I mean, I have in some ways, but then I was married for about 10 years. By the time we got divorced, I sort of got myself well involved with this country. And I thought about going back to Britain, but I'd sort of sold everything up there. So I thought, well, I might as well just stay put. And I bought new horses and got myself going, and I had a good sponsorship. And so I stayed put, and that was it. But I don't regret it. I mean, obviously it's not as glamorous as going off to the major internationals, but on the other hand, I sort of done all that. It was a different kind of a lifestyle.
I was just going to say, Anneli, obviously, you know, your life now is very much based in South Africa, but your great niece is Izzy Taylor, who is a very, very well-known event rider. Do you follow eventing much now? And do you still have an interest?
Not nearly as much as I probably should, because it's become so technical now and so professional, perhaps, for want of a better word, which, I mean, it's fine. And obviously, Isabel, she stayed with me for a year when I was based in Holland, and she went on from strength to strength. I don't know, when I was eventing, I just had to, somehow or other, I didn't get sponsorships and things like that. There wasn't really any money in it at all. But nowadays, I think you can make a little bit winning at badminton and whatever.
I bet Izzy wishes she had a horse like Monarch. I mean, I think he'd be a very competitive horse now, though, wouldn't he? Because he was so strong in all three phases. He wasn't just a brave horse.
No.
You know, he was multiple talented.
Yeah, no, he was too talented. He was. I was so scared of hurting him because I realised he was something out of this world. In fact, he was nominated in some other, I don't know what it was. They did a nomination of the 50 top horses of the last century, and he was nominated as one of them. And that's counting racehorses and everything.
Dressage was very strong, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. I was quite sort of proficient by then. But and I hadn't allowed things to go wrong. He absolutely hated jumping a ditch. So when I first started doing that, walking through water and these, I used to sit on him for hours to get him, or persuade him to do it. Once he understood, it was all right. He had an enormous buck. And so if he said he didn't want to do something and you gave him a smack, you'd go flying. There was no...
There was no looking back. I mean, he is one of the most incredible horses, and we've talked about a few of his accomplishments on this show. But I mean, he was shortlisted for the Olympics in all three disciplines, in dressage and jumping and in eventing, which is just unheard of. I think he was also scouted as a potential Gold Cup horse. Is that right? Which for a horse whose grandmother was a pony.
Yeah. Amazing. He was a complete freak. I had to give him one more gallop before badminton, and there was a trainer quite close to where I was stabled, and I phoned him up. I said, could I use your gallop? I just need one more before going to badminton to clear his windpipes. And he said, no, you can willingly use it, but I'll have to put a jockey on him because you're not allowed to put amateurs on the gallop. So I thought, well, it doesn't really matter. It's for his windpipe clearance. So when I got there, the trainer had a bit of a twinkle in his eye, and he said, I'm going to let your horse gallop with Flame Gun. And Flame Gun was the very famous 2-mile chaser of the time. And I mean, he was sort of, everybody knew who Flame Gun was. So I thought, well, it doesn't really matter. But I could see he wanted to show off a little bit how a warm blood horse could be outdone by this superb thoroughbred. So the off they went. I think they went 1.5 miles and did a circuit, and then up the final straight was slightly uphill, just straight, and they then let them go. And Monarch left Flame Gun standing by about 10 lengths, and the trainer just could not believe. He said, "What is this horse?" And so he said, "No, I'll train him for you for nothing." But I mean, that was too late by then because he could do everything else.
I think Fred Winter trained Flame Gun. So if Fred Winter was telling you had a class racehorse, then you really did. Yes.
He wasn't actually the trainer, but I mean, he knew Monarch and he saw him, and I think he saw him when he was at badminton or something. And he said he'd love to ride him. But anyway.
He absolutely, I mean, he went to the top in jumping and in eventing, but he could have won in anything. I would love to see what he would do in the sport today. Anneli, before we go, I just want to ask you about a particular story, because for anybody who isn't aware or would like to find out more, there is a brand new autobiography called Merely a Rider, which it goes into more detail on so many interesting stories. But one that stood out for me that I would like to ask you about was a certain trip to Switzerland, which with you and your very, very precious Monarch, very nearly became a sort of a one-way ticket, and neither of you were going to come back.
Oh, yes. It was quite dramatic for all that journey. You're right. 3 horses. I think the plane was a Dakota. Anyway, it had propellers, and you could just squash 3 horses in. It was two in the front, and then piles of luggage, and one stall sort of a bit further back with the luggage between the 2 front horses and the third horse. And the girl who owned the third horse didn't say that the horse wouldn't go into a partition because she didn't want to lose the chance of going to compete in Switzerland. Well, anyway, the horse is one of those, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it was one of those horses that panicked when it was restricted in a partition and lay down. Anyway, we didn't do anything until we took off, and we were actually just about to go over the Alps, and this horse started to lean up against the side of the partition and panic. And then he tried to jump out, reared up, and hit his head on the roof of this small plane, and then got his front feet over the front of the partition. And of course, you can't get him back because he was a great big sort of heavy horse. I mean, but you couldn't physically get it back, and you couldn't undo the partition because it was all nailed together, and it was all horrible. And then finally, that's right. We had a vet with us, and he gave him a shot of tranquilizer. I think he gave him morphine or something. But the horse got worse, and then started to fight and lash around, and then tried to jump on the back of the 2 front horses with his feet in the luggage, and because there was piles of luggage between him and the 2 front horses. And anyway, he had his feet through all the tops of the suitcases, and having had the injection, it took effect about 20 minutes afterwards, and then he started to calm down because he was sort of half asleep. But his feet were all in all our suitcases and whatever. And then the pilot's assistant actually came down from the pilot wherever he was, and he said, "I've got bad news. That horse that's just been making all this problem, he's just broken all the controls to the rudder, and we're going to have to crash land." And that we were right over the Alps at this time. Well, that was it. I thought, well, we're going to crash land on the top of one of these mountains. So there's nothing one could do. I mean, you just sat and pray. Anyway, the pilot was very good, amazing. He was an ex-war bomb pilot. He knew how to do things better than most. And he managed to crash land actually on the airport in Geneva. Not that we really realized it, because he was so proficient at doing what he was doing. But there were 2 sort of fire engines landing each side of us. I mean, driving each side of us as we landed, because they expected the plane to burst into flames. It didn't. So that was, there we were. We arrived safely, but it was a very horrible moment.
Just extraordinary. It's no wonder that you've ever got on a plane ever again. I think I would be.
Yeah.
I think I'd be walking everywhere. It has been just the most extraordinary career, and there are so many amazing stories. Anneli, thank you so much for coming on our Hall of Fame show. It has been fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, it's been a long time, but yeah, I'm very lucky. I mean, I only broke one bone in my life, which was a collarbone when I was 16 on a pony. So I was very accident free. I actually got a bit of a sort of thing. I think that if you're a good enough rider, you shouldn't have accidents. No, I mean, it can happen, of course. But generally speaking, I think if you're a good rider, you shouldn't. You've got to keep away from them.
Well, your career and your journey has just been absolutely remarkable. Catherine, I have enjoyed this every bit as much as I thought I was going to.
Hasn't it been brilliant? So interesting. And it's a different era, yet the skills required were absolutely no less. And I think that's worth remembering. And it's fascinating to talk to someone who has done so many interesting things in their life. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for being interested.
And Anneli, thank you so much. Listeners, if you would like to hear more stories on Anneli's incredible career, then you can find Merely a Rider, an autobiography, which is available now across... it's on Amazon. I mean, if you're on Amazon, you've absolutely made it. On Amazon, it is available from good retailers as well. Go and check it out. And we will put a link actually in these podcast notes as to where you're able to go and find it. So look, go and check it out. Lots of very, very cool stories and much more in depth than some of the points that we've made in this show, which is just that Anneli Drummond-Hay, the most remarkable career, a real pathfinder in eventing and in show jumping as well. And just an extraordinary story. So Anneli, thank you. Catherine, thank you. Listeners, we will be back soon with more on the Echo Ratings Eventing podcast. And I'm sure we will have another episode in the Echo Ratings Hall of Fame series before too long.
Thank you for being such a good interviewer.
Thank you for listening to the Echo Ratings Eventing podcast.
Have a wonderful day, everybody. And I look forward to having you back with us soon.
Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram for more.
Listeners, we'll speak to you again soon.